Dando continuidade ao Seminário Internacional de Políticas Públicas do Esporte de Alto Rendimento, gostaria de registrar aqui o prazer imenso de estar mediando essa mesa com duas pessoas que a gente considera autoridades nessa área, em assuntos específicos, um mais tratando a questão da administração esportiva e um outro também com uma perspectiva de ciência política e sociologia do esporte. Então, eu vou fazer uma breve apresentação de ambos os palestrantes, já vou passar a palavra para eles para a gente ganhar um pouco mais de tempo nessas apresentações e posteriormente no espaço das questões, comentários, discussões. Então, aqui do meu lado direito, gostaria de apresentar o professor Peter Donnelly. Ele é diretor do Centro de Estudos em Política para o Esporte e professor da Universidade de Toronto, Canadá. Suas pesquisas incluem políticas públicas para o esporte, questões políticas incluindo a área dos direitos das crianças no esporte, esportes e subcultura, entre outras áreas. Publicou amplamente na área da sociologia do esporte. É autor de diversos livros, capítulos como, por exemplo, Inside Sports, Using Sociology to Understand the Athletes and Sport Experience, Take Sport Serious, Social Issues in Canadian Sport, Sport and Society, Issues and Controversies, além de vários artigos acadêmicos publicados. No lado esquerdo, a gente tem o professor Gonzalo Bravo. Ele é professor de administração esportiva na West Virginia University, nos Estados Unidos. Leciona os cursos de graduação e pós-graduação em governança do esporte, esporte no mercado global, métodos de investigação e história e filosofia das modalidades esportivas. Antes de ingressar na academia, trabalhou durante 10 anos como diretor executivo de um dos maiores clubes multiesportivos da América do Sul, o Clube Deportivo Universidade Católica do Chile, onde esteve envolvido com todas as operações, incluindo finanças, marketing e recursos humanos. Em 94, foi convidado pela presidência do Chile a fazer parte do Conselho Consultivo do Desporto e liderando um projeto de pesquisa para estabelecer a base para a lei do esporte nesse país. Atualmente, suas pesquisas incluem comportamento organizacional aplicado em organizações esportivas e políticas de governança e aspectos do esporte. Seu trabalho sobre a política e governança tem examinado o papel das estruturas políticas e privadas na definição do sistema de desporto entre os países latino-americanos. É coeditor do livro International Sport Management, pela Human Kinetics, 2012, e coeditor do livro Sport na América Latina, Policy Organization and Management, que será publicado em 2015 no Reino Unido. Em 2008 e 2009 foi peça fundamental para a criação de duas organizações acadêmicas latino-americanas relacionadas ao estudo do esporte: a Associação Latino-Americana de Gestão do Desporto, a ALGED, e a Associação Latino-Americana de Estudos Socioculturais do Esporte, a ALESD. Então, eu passo a palavra, já agradecendo a todos a presença e, inclusive, os nossos convidados, ao professor Peter Donnelly.
Pronto?
Hello. Oh, good. So let me say thank you to the organizers for their wonderful hospitality and their great company while we've been here, particularly Fernando Mezzadri, Vanderlei, and Dora, and all of their great students. It's my first time in Brazil, and it's such a pleasure to be in a country that has sport in its constitution. You have a constitutional right to participate in sport, which I think is almost unique in the world. And which should be a great benefit to sport for all in this country, part of my topic today. But it's also exciting to be in here at this time during your unique social experiment, hosting two biggest sports events in the world just 2 years apart. So I think it's a great pleasure to be here. The American historian Lynn Hunt said human rights are still easier to endorse than to enforce. And I would make exactly the same argument for legacies. We all say that legacies are an important thing from sports events, but they're not always realized. All major national and municipal events, major games, expos, they're all expensive and they all leave legacies. For example, the Eiffel Tower is a legacy of the Parisian Expo in the late 19th century. The Montreal Metro is a legacy of the Montreal Olympics. Debt is a legacy of pretty much all of these events. Homeless people are very often a legacy of these events. Sport facilities that are not used are very often a legacy of these events. Positive legacy is very often renewed infrastructure, and environmental degradation is very often a legacy of hosting major events. Let me say that legacies are an important topic in Canada at this time, because in 2010 we hosted the Winter Olympics in Vancouver, and my colleagues in British Columbia recently published the Legacy Report. And next year we host the Pan American and Para-Pan American Games in Toronto. And my presentation today combines research we have done in Toronto with what we know about legacy from our colleagues in Europe and elsewhere. If I had spoken before the Secretary this afternoon, he would have been able to say, no, Brazil is doing much better. We have learned from some of the same research that I'll be presenting today. Unfortunately, Toronto hasn't learned, and that's why I'm still concerned about these issues. Toronto hasn't learned nearly as well as Brazil. But because the Secretary spoke before me, I did an awful lot of rewriting while he was speaking, because he was already challenging some of the points that I was making. So I haven't been able to change the slides, but I've changed some of my text to reflect the new information that we all received this afternoon from the Secretary. Next. Oh, it's there. Okay, so legacies have become an imperative. The IOC is concerned particularly about social responsibility and how much the Olympics cost. It's having another wave of reform now, but the IOC recognizes that there are both costs and benefits from hosting major events. The costs are usually underestimated. The benefits are usually overestimated when we host major events. Hashtag legacy has been trending now for about 10 years, even longer than Twitter has been around. So it's a key thing, and the IOC held its very first legacy conference in 2004, I think. The IOC currently lists the following 5 legacy areas for countries and cities that are bidding for Olympic Games. A sporting legacy, a social legacy, an environmental legacy, an urban legacy, and an economic legacy. So what has been claimed as a legacy, and what have we actually seen in the past? We've seen lots of claims about intangible legacies. These intangible legacies are difficult to measure, and they may be a little ephemeral. They perhaps exist just for a short time. So civic pride, national pride. How do we measure national pride? If your country sings the national anthem louder than my country, does that mean you have more national pride than my country? country? No, of course not. So it's very difficult to measure national pride, and national pride goes up and down over time. International status is certainly what governments are hoping to achieve by hosting major events, and a trained cohort of volunteers is also often represented as a legacy, but if we don't use those volunteers again, they're not very much of a legacy. So we have to figure that part out. Of the tangible legacies, the main ones that we think about are the non-sport infrastructure. Modern major events involve lots of security and lots of security concerns. And every city that's hosted an Olympic Games in recent years has put in lots of security cameras all over the city where the Olympics is being hosted, and then they never take them down after the event. So that's kind of a legacy that we didn't ask for, probably. Transportation is a positive legacy. Very often, roads are built, mass transit is constructed, airports are constructed. They're important, but they're often used by the construction industry to extort additional funding from governments who are desperate to have them finished. If we look at the next one as well, housing. Most of the big books that I've looked at have promised that the Olympic Village will be turned into housing for both low-income and middle-income people, and almost always it becomes housing for high-income people. So it's rarely for those who are promised. But if we look at the people who love the Olympics and who push the hardest for the Olympics in any city in the world, it's probably the property developers and the construction corporations. And they represent private profits on the back of public risk. Public risk is public funding, and they are able to achieve private profit from that. Look at the tangible legacies in terms of infrastructure, the sporting infrastructure. One of the most uncomfortable things that comes from major sports events is the abandoned, the unused facilities once the event is over because they cost so much to run, or because, can you just show the next slide and then go back? This is the Olympic beach volleyball arena in Athens, which was built for the 2004 Olympics. This is what it looked like in 2012. It's clearly not been used for beach volleyball over that whole period of time. So I think there's a real concern about the subsequent use of facilities. If you check the World Stadium Index on the Play the Game website, you will see lots of examples of stadiums that have become what we call white elephants. They're just not used or underused now. And there's also a photo exhibit that's online that you can see now of the Beijing facilities and the Athens facilities that are not being used anymore, and they just look terrible. So I mean, it's a very unfortunate a legacy that we sometimes have. Sometimes the stadiums are transferred to professional sports teams. Certainly in Atlanta that was the case. It looks like it's going to be the case in London, but it still hasn't been decided, I think, for the London Stadium. Again, that's very often public risk for private profit, because usually the professional sports team doesn't have to pay the whole price for the stadium. They don't pay the market value. Sometimes they pay almost nothing. It's just given to them, as it has been for a couple of events in Canada. Sometimes the facilities are reserved for high-performance training and competition, so only the same athletes that use them in the competition, but for the Olympics, they're the only people who still get to use the facilities. And then we have multi-use agreements and facilities where public and community uses has been negotiated. So the speed skating oval in Calgary from the 1976 Olympics, and the one in Vancouver from the 2010 Winter Olympics are both open to the public now, but they both open at a cost. And you can see the cost from the Richmond Oval. It's almost $17 for a day to go and skate there, or almost $7 for just public skating at the Calgary Oval. This is a concern in Toronto now because of the Pan American Games, and the swim complex for the Pan American Games has been built on my university campus. But before it was built, and because of the kind of research that we know about legacies, a multi-use agreement was put in place. So the swim complex was paid for by the federal government, by the provincial government of Ontario, by the city of Toronto, and by the university. And they wanted to see a use agreement in place, and we just finalized that use agreement so that after the Pan American Games, the swim complex will be used by high-performance athletes. It'll be used by university competitive teams. It'll be used for university students just for recreational swimming, and it will be open for community use. So those agreements are in place now. And the funding to keep the pool open and to keep the pool clean and heated and lighted is all in place for it. So I think that's the kind of thing that we need to be looking for in legacies these days. So Brazil has just joined the global sporting arms race. And what that means is that Brazil wants to compete with other countries to be in the top 10 in the medal table. And we take this from the arms race between nuclear powers. We take this idea, the idea that during the Cold War, if the Soviet Union built a hydrogen bomb, the United States would have to build a hydrogen bomb. So it's this arms race where, in order to stay level, we have to spend more and more money, and that seems to be applied to Olympic medals now. We call it the global sporting arms race for Olympic medals. So in the 4 years before the London Olympics, I use the English acronym rather than the Portuguese acronym for the Brazilian Olympic Committee here. But they provided $350 million in funding to Brazilian athletes. And in London, Brazil won 17 medals and was in 14th place, equal 14th place in the medal table. Just 2 months ago, there was a news report that the Brazilian Olympic Committee had pledged $600 million. That's over $1 billion reais, as I understand it. And the report I read said it was from public and private sources, but it never indicated how much was from public sources and how much was from private sources. And that this money was for the next 2 years to support approximately 400 Brazilian athletes who will compete in Rio in 2016. At that Olympics, as the Secretary has said several times, Brazil hopes to win 27 to 30 medals and finish in the top 10 in the medal table. So is Brazil and the Brazilian Olympic Committee trying to buy more medals? Well, of course they are. Every country in the global sporting arms race is buying medals. and by definition, trying to outspend other countries in order to win those medals. Will anything change in Brazil if Brazil wins lots of medals in 2016? And here I base it on past research rather than on what the Secretary told us will happen this afternoon. But so, will Brazil rank higher than, I think it's currently at 79 on the United Nations Human Development Index, as a result of winning lots of medals in Rio? Only if the Olympics are deliberately used to develop, or as part of a plan, to develop infrastructure and services to improve the lives of ordinary people. Then the Olympics will help to move Brazil up the Human Development Index. Will any of Brazil's social problems be solved if you win lots of medals in Rio? Again, only if there is a deliberate plan to use the Olympics as part of a plan for Brazil or for Rio to achieve a legacy of resolving a particular social problem. So, I'm going to be saying this several times, so I'll say it now to begin with. If you want a legacy, you have to plan for it and you have to fund it. And then you can aim sport at the problems that you need to aim it at. You can't just sit back and wait for it to happen. So will more people participate in sport in Brazil if you win lots of medals? Well, I'm going to get to that in a couple of minutes. As Barry Houlihan argued this morning, Olympic success is a burden for a country. If Brazil does end up in the top 10 in Olympic medals, and it will create expectations in the Brazilian population that this is the way things should be. It will also create expectations in the government. It can oblige a country to continue to try to be successful because no country wants to see itself moving down the medal table. Australia and Canada, and I think the UK, are all in this position now where they've had major success at the Olympics and they're very concerned about moving down the medal table, and so they're putting more and more money in. And as we've seen from both Barry's presentation and from lots of data, that it costs more and more dollars every year to even stay in the same place in the Olympic medal table, and it costs even more money to move up that Olympic medal table. So in a sense, that, as we've seen, the countries who put the most funding into high-performance sport are generally the ones that win the most medals. So, global sporting arms race. What does it do when you join the global sporting arms race? Well, first of all, it distorts your sports system. It makes your sports system into something that you might not have wanted if you begin to focus on high-performance funding for medals. What we've noticed in a number of countries, and particularly in Canada at the moment, is that there's much less government funding for team sports. And why is that? Because there's only two gold medals in team sports, one for men and one for women. And so it's very difficult to win a team sport Olympic medal. It's much easier to win a medal in athletics or swimming or any of the multi-medal events at the Olympics. And so many countries have begun to focus on those multi-medal events. We see more funding on sports played by very few people. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. In Australia, a report in Australia a couple of years ago they discovered that more government money was going into archery. I think probably everybody who does archery in Australia could fit into this room. And more money was going into archery than into cricket. That would be like Brazil giving more money to archery than to capoeira, for example. Okay. In Canada, we found a similar situation. Cricket is not an Olympic sport, so that's why it wasn't getting the funding. But basketball is an Olympic sport, but it's a team sport. In the year before the Vancouver Olympics, the Canadian government gave $3 million in additional funding, not base funding, but additional funding to the 3 sliding sports, the bobsled, luge, and skeleton. If you think how many people in Canada participate in those 3 sports, they could probably all fit on that side of the room. All of the Canadians who participate. Basketball Canada gets $3 million each year in government funding for this huge participation sport in the country. So you can see that it distorts your system. It means that so much money is going to just to try to win medals, but not to support your sports system in any way. As the Secretary said today, Brazil appears to have taken this into account to some extent. I read a report from Marcos Vinicius of the Brazilian Olympic Committee, who said that our idea for Olympic power is not focusing on some 3 or 4 sports. It's more open for sports. For us, Olympic power is more than 10 or 12 different disciplines. And I think we heard from the Secretary today that Brazil is going to be trying for all 24 disciplines in Brazil. So I think you can see that certainly the Brazilian Organizing Committee and the Ministry of Sport have learned from what some places have been doing in the past, and they're trying not to distort the Brazilian sports system as much as other sports systems have been distorted. All sports systems work, as we've heard in the last couple of days here, all work on early talent identification systems. This has been happening since the 1960s. It's spread from Eastern Europe to pretty much any country that is in the global sporting arms race. They want to identify talented athletes as young as possible, potentially talented athletes as young as possible, and then put them into a specialist training system. With the exception of China and Cuba, and that's because every child in China and Cuba gets looked at as a potential Olympic athlete and measured and observed for potential talent. The rest of the world, Olympic athletes are increasingly coming from a small and wealthy percentage of the population. Although again, I'm pleased to hear from the Secretary this afternoon that your Olympic athletes are coming from social classes C and D, or many of them are coming. I'm sure that the equestrians and the sailors are not in class C and D, but maybe many of the other athletes are. Funding becomes focused on fewer and fewer athletes, so you don't have a pyramid anymore, you don't have a development system, you have people's sport over here, community sport, and then you have a very expensive elite development system for fewer and fewer athletes, and the more likely you are to win a medal or expected to win a medal, the more likely lots of money will be aimed in your direction. The consequences of this for Canada are clear. Let me just show you some data from Canada. The red line here is the best measure that we have of participation in organized sport in Canada. The survey has been done with a large sample about 25,000 of the population, and it's been done 4 times in the last 20 years. During that period of time, participation in organized sports has gone from 45% of the population down to now, the last survey, 26% of the population. Now this is a complex notion because it doesn't mean that people just stop being active, but it means that they did stop participating in organized sport. During that same period of time, Canada started, and each of the data points on the blue line is combined summer and winter Olympics. The number of medals that Canada won in combined summer and winter Olympics. And that's the case because Canada sends full team to both summer and winter Olympics. So while it would be more appropriate for Brazil just to count summer Olympic medals, Canada counts both medals. So this is both summer and winter Olympics. In both summer and winter Olympics, Canada only earned 15 medals in 1988. That last data point on the right there is Vancouver and London. Okay, at Vancouver and London, the number of medals that Canada won at those 2 Olympics is 44 medals. So, what's happened during that 20-year period of time? Well, perhaps more than anything, Canada has really joined the global sporting arms race. And that same line, that same blue line, would, if we plotted the funding for high-performance sport along that same blue line, it would be equivalent. Because the more we spent, the more medals we started to win, and then the public and the government gets addicted to winning medals and keeps wanting to win more and more medals. Particularly in a much more conservative government than your government, where your government is thinking much more about social policy from the presentation I heard earlier than our government. Our government is focused very much on just winning medals, and they really don't care about participation very much. So, this is the second English elephant metaphor. When we talk about something that is so big that we're afraid to talk about it, we call it the elephant in the room. What is the elephant in the room here? The elephant in the room is participation. And participation has a very troublesome, difficult relationship with high performance. And we've seen what's been happening with high performance. Governments in middle and high-income countries recently have growing concerns about the increase in non-communicable diseases, heart diseases, diabetes, those non-communicable diseases that seem to be increasing because of lower activity levels in the population and poor nutrition from fast food places, for example. And governments very often will talk about the need to connect elite sport to increased physical activity participation, but far more effort is continually put into increasing the number of medals that we win than it is into increasing the activity level of the population. Perhaps the most deliberate efforts towards this have been in the UK recently. The Commonwealth Games were just held in Glasgow a few weeks ago, and as a legacy of the Commonwealth Games, Glasgow attempted to make a learn to swim, open swimming program, free swimming program for all children in the city. So they had that as a legacy. Tony Blair, when London won the 2012 Olympics in 2005, made major promises and provided funding for increased participation in sport in the UK and and towards international development. Almost all of that money was eventually clawed back because of the 2008 recession and because of increased Olympic facility and security costs in London. So the promise was made, the attempt was made to increase participation. But instead of withdrawing funding for the Olympic facilities or reducing security, the money was taken away from participation. And that seems to be very often the case. So far? Okay, good. I'll finish in the next 10 minutes. So, participation and inspiration. The International Olympic Committee, governments, and Olympic organizing committees all say that high performance is important because it will inspire increased participation in sport. That is, that people will be so inspired by the performance of the country's athletes that they will, and this is pretty much part of Olympic policy. If you read the Sport for All document from the International Olympic Committee, that is very much a part of it, that the elite athletes will inspire people to become active. This is used as a justification. It's actually a very cost-free justification for spending so much money on high-performance sport. But there's no real evidence. Barry and I have both looked very hard at the evidence for this, and we have found no real evidence that participation in a country increases when that country hosts an Olympics or when medals are won by athletes from that country. Now, we looked into this a little bit more closely in Canada, and for a while I was saying, you know, there's no such thing as inspiration. And what we found was that young people, certainly young people who have the means to participate in Olympic-type sports, are inspired by Olympic performances. So, for example, we talked to rowing clubs after Canada won a number of medals in rowing. And the rowing club said lots of people showed up and they wanted to join. There were lots of young women who wanted to come and participate in rowing, but we could only take a few of them because the club is full. We didn't have any space to train any new rowers. Same thing happened after Vancouver with speed skating. Again, Canada didn't win many medals because the Netherlands won all of the medals in speed skating. But people were inspired, young people were inspired by speed skating. They tried to join the speed skating club. The president of the Ottawa Speed Skating Club told us that after the events finished, 300 young people tried to join the speed skating club. They took 3. They took 3 people because they didn't have any other capacity to take on additional people. They didn't have the coaching, they didn't have the time on the ice, so it wasn't possible to do that. So what is the challenge of legacy? Legacy must be a deliberate process. We can't sit back and wait for legacy to happen. Young people may be inspired to participate, but what if there's nowhere for them to play? We must plan for and we must budget for legacy in just the same way that we plan for and budget for the games. If we want a participation increase, we have to plan for and spend money on that, just as we plan for and spend money on trying to win medals. We're quite happy to spend money on infrastructure such as a subway or a new airport, and we will do that, but we don't do it so much for the much more difficult legacies like increased participation. So let me finish with some recommendations. I'm going to talk about legacy in general, and then talk specifically in my last slide about participation. How do we ensure the legacy that we would like? The first thing is clearly to harness the costs. We need a more modest, a more sustainable Olympics. When Thomas Bach reports in December of the Olympic reform process that is currently underway, I'm sure that one of the recommendations is for a more modest, more sustainable Olympic Games. It's become far too expensive for countries. That's not going to be any help at all to Rio, of course. I mean, Rio is already spent and is spending under the old system. But I think by 2015, there's probably going to be a new regime. And one of the major issues that does need to be harnessed is the blackmail from the international federations. I read a report a few months ago that the International Tennis Federation had demanded a 20,000 seat tennis stadium in Rio. Does Rio need a 20,000 seat tennis stadium? Is that something that's really necessary? It's necessary for the International Tennis Federation, for the prestige of the International Tennis Federation, for any kickbacks the International Tennis Federation may receive from the construction companies. But it's really probably not necessary. You probably would be very happy with a 5,000 seat stadium, and if you have to put 10,000 temporary seats in just for the Olympics, that would be fine. And I hope that's what is going to be done. I can't believe that you're making a new golf course in Rio because golf is in the Olympics. Weren't there any golf courses in Rio before? I'm sure there are golf courses in Rio. Why did it need a new one? Why does the International Golf Federation demand that there be a brand new golf course just for the Olympics and for whoever gets to use it afterwards? So I think that cost harnessing really needs to be a part of it, and I think it may be coming from the reform process, but it won't happen unless we keep pressuring the International Olympic Committee and the international federations. We need to make legacy plans and budgeting a part of the bid process. And now I know they're there now, but they're not very specific within the bid process. The IOC encourages bidding cities to exaggerate the legacy plans, and the IOC pretty much knows that cities are not going to achieve their legacy plans. So we need much more realistic legacy plans, I think. We need to make funding a legacy part of the event budget. We need to monitor and contract for legacy in the same way that facility construction and the provision of luxury hotel rooms for the Olympic or the Pan American or the FIFA families are monitored and contracted. You don't get to host the World Cup or the Olympic Games unless you provide however many thousand five-star hotel rooms for the people from the Olympic family or from the FIFA family. That's the way it has worked. It's contracted for. Why can't we contract for a participation legacy, for example, in just the same way that we do that? And one thing that may be interesting to do is to reintroduce prizes. The Olympics used to award prizes for artistic and creative endeavors of various kinds. And we reintroduced a prize for architecture, a prize for art, environmental innovation, a prize for the best labor and legacy practices around an Olympics. And focus those prizes on limiting costs and enhancing the environment. I think that would encourage competition to come up with innovative ways to build stadiums and to make those stadiums environmentally friendly to be part of that. So my last slide. Thank you. This is an adaptation from a proposal that we made to a position paper we sent to Sport Canada and the Canadian government and the Canadian Olympic Committee in 2008. And what we were arguing was that there's a need to reconnect this sports system. And I noticed the Secretariat reintroduced the pyramid. And now the pyramid, I argued earlier, doesn't really exist anymore because of the separation of the high-performance athletes from the rest. So when you have two parallel systems, the high-performance system and then the sports system, it's really difficult to have a pyramid. But I think if we start to reconnect the sport system, try to rebuild the pyramid, we can connect all of the funding that we're putting into high-performance sports to increasing participation. And I think we need lots of imagination, lots of creative thinking and brainstorming around this. And the sample I'm showing you is just for just what we were able to come up with for before the Vancouver Olympics. Very little of this was applied at the Vancouver Olympics, I should say. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep pushing and keep trying. So, the very first thing that is necessary if you want to build participation is you have to survey how much capacity is in the national sports organizations and the clubs to take in new people. If we inspire young people, what are they going to do about it? So how many can they take? And part of that will be to make sure that our national sport organizations are responsible for both high performance and for participation, and to fund them appropriately. And what's happened in Canada is that national sport organizations see themselves only as responsible for high performance sport. They don't see themselves having any responsibility for participation now. And certainly in Canada, there's a need to re-add that responsibility to our national sport organizations. We propose developing an open house strategy for Olympic winter sports to take place before, during, and immediately after the Olympics. And the open house would be that every sports facility where it was possible to do an Olympic winter sport would be open to the public at certain times, that Olympic athletes, when available, would be there to talk to people, and not to give the usual Olympic athlete speech where they stand and they say, if I'm motivated, you can be motivated. If I can do it, you can do it. That's what we usually hear from Olympic athletes. What I would want Olympic athletes to do is to say, I have so much fun playing this sport. I really love to do it. I enjoy it so much that I hurt myself every day to do it better. And we need to be able to find ways that Olympic athletes can engage with young people and say, why don't you try this activity? Why don't you? This is how much fun I had learning this when I was your age, and that could be quite fulfilling, I think, for Olympic athletes. Need to focus on basic skills, and I've changed it. For the Winter Olympics, we had learn to skate and learn to ski or snowboard would be basic skills for Winter Olympics in Canada. I've just suggested for Brazil, maybe learn to swim, run for fun, teach ball skills, and you have the perfect medium to do this. My Brazilian colleagues tell me all of the problems with segundo tempo. But segundo tempo is, to me, a most amazing program. It gives jobs to my students, your students. who get to work in segundo tempo programs in the field that they're trained for, and it provides, what did we see this afternoon? 4.3 million children were involved in segundo tempo in the last, at the last time they counted. So that needs to be expanded. You know, you don't even need the open house if you build a segundo tempo program. And I would suggest that when the opportunity is available, that your Olympic athletes join in on the segundo tempo programs and play with the young people who are in those programs. I think that it is the most creative thing that I've heard in physical activity for a long time. That idea that we can fund and use the after-school time in creative, active ways for school children. I think it's great. I don't care what my Brazilian colleagues say. I wish we had it in Canada, and I would love to see it there. You could even expand it for adults. Expand it for older people. Expand it for unemployed people. Expand it for people with a disability. You know, anybody who would benefit from a time and a space where they could be physically active and they got to enjoy being physically active. I think that would be terrific. We need to ensure widespread publicity for all of the participation initiatives around an Olympics. Public service announcements all the time saying, such and such a swimming pool, such and such a track will be open to the public. And there will be people there to help you and to show you the kind of things that we do at this place. People need to feel comfortable in learning some basic skills, and should not be made to feel that participation is difficult. That it can be fun, and that you just need to learn some basic things for it to be fun. And then, as I said before, and what we've done with the Pan American pool complex, swimming complex in Toronto, we need to develop really clear use policy for Olympics facilities once the Olympics are over. And it sounds like that is happening very much. The Secretary said that was happening in Brazil, and I was really pleased to hear that. And that probably is the best thing in terms of legacy that we're doing with the Pan American Games. Most other plans, not so good. We're just a year away. You have 2 years to think about this. We have only 1 year. So, obrigado.